So what are the questions that we want to address today? And I should say that this also is a little bit different format than the last few ASIs. We've generally run them with the workshop first and the public conference after. And even though for the speakers that creates a bit of redundancy, what it does do is it creates a lot of familiarity among the various speakers and gives a kind of coherence to the public conference. This year, again, for logistical reasons, we're doing it the other way around. So I expect this will have its own benefits. One benefit is that we'll get to hear some basic presentations from people. The workshop is much more conversation than it is formal presentation, so we have the advantage from the workshop point of view today of getting to hear people's thoughts first before we begin to discuss them more intensively in the workshop. The challenge, of course, is that we brought together people from very different disciplines and perspectives, some of whom are perhaps facing an audience a bit different than they usually encounter, although these days, given the topical nature of the things we're talking about, I expect that many people have spoken to very different audiences, and there certainly is a lot of interest and a lot of overlap with the mental health concerns. But just to sort of put us all a little bit on the same page, these are the questions that we had in mind in trying to bring this group of people together. The first is just to look more closely at what's meant by mindfulness as a metaphor, as a field of study and practice. It's a traveling concept. It's undergone transformation and reworking. Like any word or metaphor, it only means things when we begin to unpack it and explain precisely what we're talking about. And we'll have a bit of that this morning, both historically and in terms of contemporary approaches. One of the very striking things and part of what's motivated this meeting is the observation that traditions that were developed in one part of the world have now traveled around the globe and been taken up very avidly, but been brought into radically new contexts and been repackaged and reformulated to suit those contexts. And it raises, like all translation, all transformation, it raises questions about what's being carried over, what's being lost, what new things are being added, and we hope to have some reflections on that from our speakers and from you in the audience as well. The versions of contemplative practice of mindfulness in particular that are now common in mental health practices, again in the West, and I'm using the West just for want of a better term. You know what I mean, but we often get up here and complain about dividing the world into East and West and how strange that is and how much that just becomes an issue of projecting onto each other our, what Jung would call our shadows. So we want to get around that. Let's just say then the dominant paradigms in mental health, that those approaches to mindfulness are quite different from how meditative practice or more broadly Buddhism or other spiritual religious traditions appear in their original societies of origin. And ironically, as you'll hear, there's a kind of circulation going on so that the Western refiguring of these things is now being re-imported back into the very societies where these things emerged, with all the cachet of that this is the most modern and this is what psychiatry or psychology or other professions have endorsed and so on. And I think, again, we need to look at that. And for those of us working with migrant populations, with immigrants to Montreal or other places, it becomes a big question. What is it that we're trying to reconnect people to? What community are we referring them to? What are the real resources that are going to sustain them and help them to go forward in their lives? Another motive for this kind of conversation is the huge growth of cognitive neuroscience research work on mindfulness and other meditative practices. So with the emergence of new technologies of brain imaging and various other kinds of psychophysiological strategies, there's been a renewed interest, although this goes back to the 50s and 60s when the earliest studies were done using things like EEG and so on. We now have more sophisticated technologies that give us the illusion that we're somehow peering into the essence of things. And so there's a great excitement about these, a lot of questions about what they really teach us, if they add anything to what we already know. And we're very interested in that. And Suparna Chowdhury and others who are here who've been involved in what they call critical neuroscience, trying to look in a more nuanced way at what neuroscience can and cannot teach us about fundamentals of human experience will be another topic that we'll be addressing later today and over the course of the subsequent workshop. And finally, all of this effort to contextualize things, which is very much what we're about. I mean, I would say that those of us here at McGill, have not been particularly involved in what is a very large movement with its own conferences and journals and communities. We've been very peripheral to that, although some of us individually have our own interest and engagement in these areas. But what we bring to the table, or what we're trying to bring to ourselves, I guess, by inviting you here, is to look at this specifically in cultural context, and to ask questions about what the contexts are in Canada and Montreal, in Asia, and more globally, and to think about those in some way, see what that adds to our understanding, both of the fundamental processes that we're talking about and of the ways in which they get translated and adapted.